Hello, I'm Nan Geschke, your host for the Los Altos History Show. Tonight we have Bob Keeler and Bob Taylor with us. Welcome to the History Show, Bob and Bob.
Delighted to be here.
Oh, I'm glad you're here. Besides the fact that Bob share two of their first names in common, they also share a couple of other things. One fact is that both of them are engineers. Bob Keeler is a civil engineer, and he's worked for the California Department of Transportation. He now does some consulting on large construction projects. And Bob Taylor is a mechanical engineer, but he never worked as a mechanical engineer. He's been an editor, and he's been a public relations specialist. And now I think you're retired. Is that right, Bob?
That is right, and enjoying it immensely.
But what the two Bobs have in common that is most fascinating for us is the fact that they shared their childhood together here in Los Altos during the 30s. And they spent some of their school days at San Antonio School on San Antonio Road, the first grammar school in Los Altos. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that later on in the show. But I thought we'd start our discussion tonight by setting the stage. You know, we're going to be talking a lot about what it was like in your childhoods, but that childhood was in the 30s, when we know that there was a worldwide depression, and especially in this country suffered tremendously. Although we know that in our area in California, people were a little insulated from that shock. But I thought I would ask both of the Bobs tonight what their remembrances of those years, you know, whether their parents were frightened, how it affected their childhood, and whether it still affects you today. I think I'll start with Bob T.
All righty. Well, we really lived in an area that was quite insulated from the Depression. As Nan mentioned, it was agricultural in nature. And people just had so much confidence in the future that we as youngsters were not aware of the fact that a depression was taking place. And I personally do not remember my parents ever talking about that. Of course, we also grew a lot of our own food, vegetables, one thing another, chickens and so on. And people all worked together, and there just simply was not that much effect of the Depression in Los Altos as we were growing up.
So the fact that we had, that Los Altos was so agricultural during the 30s, and we have that evidence with our History House Museum, which is interpreted as the 30s farmhouse, and with all of the outbuildings around it, that really was the apex of the agricultural economy in Los Altos, and so that it kind of
certainly
insulated.
part of it. And another thing was that from a recreational standpoint, we had everything you could ever want with the grammar school, with all of its athletic fields and one thing and another, and literally square miles of land that was not developed, where you could go climb trees, chase rabbits, play in the poison oak, and do all those things that boys like to do.
Free recreation, rather.
Right.
Now, how about you, Bob? What do you remember your parents talking about it? You know, what are your memories?
I agree with Bob that we were pretty well sheltered from it here. You did hear about it a little bit on the news, there were people that, with the train coming through town, that were riding the rails, and occasionally they would come by and want a meal, which our folks would give them, so we seemed to have plenty of food. And everybody, had a feeling that they could always make ends meet, and sooner or later things would get better. So I don't think we suffered from it nearly as bad as people maybe in a large city did.
So there was a great feeling of hope then, and
much.
optimism,
Yeah.
even though people may have had to go without a lot of time.
And particularly as youngsters, we had everything that we could ever want. Things that money simply can't buy.
Now
the
paint
right
a
environment.
picture for us of what Los Altos looked like in the 30s. I'm going to ask you, Bob, first, Bob K. What that town looked like. And can you just visualize for us so we can?
It was a very small. Main part of town was really considered the triangle between Edith first and San Antonio. The main residential streets were University and Orange, and then houses were scattered around. The further away you got from the downtown part, the further apart the houses got. And it was, large parcels, orchards, a few small vineyards, that sort of thing.
Oh, where were the vineyards?
Well, there was one vineyard up there fairly close to where the Bank of America building is at Loyola Corners, a small one.
Oh, I didn't realize that. Do you remember the name of it by any chance?
No, I mean, it was not the type of formal thing that they have now where they have a wine tasting room
No
and that sort of
tasting
thing. No. It was just a couple acres with some grapevines.
Oh, that's neat.
Then, of course, they also grew grapes up at the Jesuit Retreat House.
Yes, I know that. So, how about you, Bob? What are your memories about those early days?
Yeah, very much the same as Bob's. I don't want to get into this business of you're absolutely right, Bob, type of thing, but it was that way. It was that the houses, very few houses had less than an acre of land around them. And where we ultimately ended up living, why we really literally didn't have neighbors because we were on a 15-acre parcel that my father was able to pick up for $500 an acre, which would be a little hard to do right now.
Now, some agricultural communities are rather insulated or isolated, and you feel you are isolated. Was Los Altos that kind of a community, or was it one where there was a lot of dynamic going on between the neighbors?
I would say that there was a lot of dynamic going on, and it was mainly around the school. And also, we had interurban transportation, I'm probably getting ahead of myself here, which involved us with surrounding towns quite a bit. Many people commuted, but there were a lot of activities at the Los Altos Grammar School, which I guess they now refer to as the San Antonio School. And then, of course, the Scout activities from a standpoint of young people. Many things happened there at the Scout Hall. And
so the town then wouldn't be considered standoffish then, you don't think?
No, I don't believe so. I don't think we consider ourselves isolated. We all had, or most everyone had automobiles. We had the train. There was a bus line that came through here. You could go to Palo Alto, San Francisco, San Jose. So I don't believe
so there was a real feeling
we were isolated, and I don't think we were really standoffish. I think we welcomed anybody who came and made any effort to be sociable.
Right. Sometimes that's a criticism that Los Altos has now. I mean, people will say, "Oh, Los Altos, it's rather a."
It really wasn't in those days at all. Everybody.
I don't
was
think
your
it is
neighbor.
now. I think it's just it's an unfair criticism of the town. But
well, as an old timer, I find that some of the people that have moved here lately, in the last 20 years or so, seem to think that Los Altos is a little bit better than Mountain View, for instance, or some of the other towns, and that sort of irritates the people in those towns.
Well, that's a fair enough assumption, I guess, for some people.
But we didn't have that kind of thing back in the old days.
Now, what were some of the stores, Bob K., on Main Street that you remember as a child? If you would. Yeah, I imagine your mother would let you go downtown anytime you felt like it.
Yeah, we went downtown whenever we desired. There was
a little different than it is today.
Right. We owned the town.
Yeah. Well, there were two grocery stores. Well, the J&S and the Red and White.
J&S for Jones.
J&S stood for Jones and Shop. It
Paul
was
Schaub,
on
the
one
farm.
side of Main Street. The red and white was owned by Don Gordon. It was on the other side of the Main Street. There was a drugstore next to the J&S grocery store. It was, I believe, Gregory's Pharmacy, and then it became Kahn's Pharmacy.
And there's still Kahn's Pharmacy in
Still
town.
Kahn's in town. There was Mac's. There was a hardware store. There was a bank. Well, we had a movie. What?
A little
Couple
bit,
of,
actually.
well,
It's
yeah,
bigger than I thought
We
it
had Lane's
would be.
Creamery, and we had another little place where you could get sandwiches and soft drinks and that sort of thing.
Also, Los Altos now has become quite a destination for lunch and dinner. Was it in those days? I doubt it.
It really
but
wasn't. No, in those days, people entertained at home, which was nice, and it was sort of gracious, and it was a kind of a good way to do it. And again, coming out of the Depression, it made a lot of sense to do it that way. And if they wanted to eat out, they would go to Palo Alto or San Francisco.
what were some of the restaurants along the El Camino?
Well, I guess Ricky's came in one of the earlier ones. Dinah's Shack was certainly one of the ones that goes
I
back a
remember
bit.
Dinah's Shack.
You were, well, my,
That wasn't
you're
that
much
long
too young
ago.
to remember Dinah's. No. And what would be another one? What used to be Chez Louis L'Omelette, yes, was one of the early
That
ones.
was the big hangout
And it
for
seems
Stanford.
to me there were a couple of Oriental restaurants in downtown Palo Alto. But so far as Los Altos was concerned, it was a couple of creameries. And
That's
that was about it.
interesting.
Where we would occasionally be allowed to come up and have lunch during our school days.
Well, tell me about San Antonio School, because I think there's a lot of nostalgia. I've talked to some of the older residents, and there was a lot of love for that school and for the principals who were our first educators here in Los Altos. So how about you, Bob K? What is your most vivid memory of your school day? You remember doing it with
Well,
Bob here?
I think the most vivid memory
Careful now.
it was in the 7th grade with John Ames was our teacher. He used to be up at the blackboard writing things on the blackboard, and suddenly he'd wheel around and heave an eraser at somebody in the back of the room.
Oh boy.
That's how he kept us in line. We were a little bit noisy at times, but we got an excellent education at that grammar school. They had classes with about 40 pupils in each class, and
40. Now that's a large number.
they had discipline, and we learned what we needed to learn in order to go on to high school and go on to college. And I think our generation managed to put somebody on the moon. We managed to build an aqueduct system in California. We managed to build a very excellent highway and freeway system in California, and so on and so forth. And we did it in classes of 40 people.
That's interesting. How about you, Bob T?
Well, I think, as Bob says, a high percentage of our people went on to college and did accomplish things. It was what I thought was off. Well, I put it fairly succinctly. I would love to send my children to Los Altos Grammar School as I knew it. I felt that the teachers were stern enough, but they were very, very fair. And another thing that is not allowed now that was then they were allowed to run the school themselves. And they had the support of the entire community, and all the teachers lived in the community, and they were part of us. And getting back to Mr. Ames, another thing about him that was so great was he was a naturalist, and he used to have cages. One time we had a raccoon in the class for a few days, so it decided to break out and smash a window and leave. But it was just a perfect kind of a place to go, and it was safe.
I have this book that I've actually mentioned it on the show before. It's called Los Altos, A Portrait of Our Community, A Century of Photos. And in it is a wonderful picture, I don't know if the camera can pick it up, but of the whole school in front of the old San Antonio grade school. And I think we'll probably pick this up a little later with some extra tape, but I really highly recommend this book, which you can pick up at History House. It's called Los Altos portrait community, and it's mostly photographs, but they're some of the best photographs that we have of Los Altos. Now, have you kept up with some of the classmates, Bob? Have you? I know you've kept in
Bob perhaps has
contact.
done a better job than I have, but
Yeah,
it took me 40 years to find you.
I've been in contact with some of them. In fact, one of them, we'd been going to the San Jose Civic Light Opera together for the last 7 or 8 years, but we recently just ceased doing that. But we're in touch with them, and some of the other fellows that we went to school with, I'm in touch with.
And so, do they still live in the area here?
Some do, yeah.
Oh, that's nice.
Mhm.
That's nice. I know. Now, one of the features of Los Altos was the train. You know, the train that ran on what virtually is now Foothill Expressway, and it traveled from. Actually, some parts of it, it was a spur, but it traveled from Los Angeles all the way up through San Francisco at one time.
Right. Well, I think you run that comes off of the main line went from San Francisco to Los Gatos, and many of the people here commuted to San Francisco on that run, and they had 2 trains each, 2 trains in the morning and 2 trains in the afternoon. Paul Shoup, the president of Southern Pacific, lived in Los Altos, and that didn't do us any harm. They also had streetcars and buses back in a time when there might have been a maximum of 3,000 people in this area, and now what would you say, there are 40,000 and they don't have any of them.
No public
Would
transportation.
that be to say that we've gone resolutely backwards in interurban transportation?
Yeah, well, definitely, it's definitely a lack, and it's, you know, people still are talking about the fact that the BART didn't come down this side of the bay, and you know, we're really paying for it now. Now, did many people used the trains to commute up to San Francisco? In those days, San Jose didn't have the business center that it has, but now. But did either of your fathers commute?
For many, many years, until he finally just set up an office at our own home in Los Altos. But
And your father was a writer, wasn't he?
right. Yes, he wrote. Ultimately, he started out as a war correspondent in World War I, and then he ultimately ended up writing for Reader's Digest, Saturday Evening Post, Collier's, and Holiday, and magazines like that.
And his name was
Frank J. Taylor. He was quite a prolific writer. He picked the world's worst way of making a living and succeeded at it. I couldn't have done it. I got to hand it to him. You're okay, Dad.
And he picks Los Altos because
he just thought it was about the nicest place he could find.
Oh, that's a nice testimonial.
Well, you see, when you're a freelance writer, you can do that. You can write. Well, in his case, he did commute to San Francisco for quite a good many years, and then he began to realize, well, why did he bother to do that? He just had his own office up on the hilltop there, where they built a place on West Sunset Drive, and had a secretary come in for about a half a day each day, and he could do all of his work that way.
Right. So what do you remember about the trains, Bob K.?
Well, just the fact that they came by twice a day in the morning and twice a day in the evening, and you got so used to the times that they were coming by that periodically, when a freight train came by, you might almost get clobbered when you were trying to cross the tracks, because you didn't really expect a train at that time. But other than that, I didn't use the train that much. I either used an automobile or we used the bus, and went to the main line.
But it was just a fact of life that this train would come and go, and we now have that wonderful reminder of that era with the train depot.
Yeah. But I do remember the train used to come through on weekends with people from San Francisco going to Santa Cruz.
Santa Cruz.
So.
And who was the station master that was
Mr. Reddington. He was just such a nice guy. Freight and one thing and another would be processed by him as well. You know, if stuff coming by mail or whatever, anything that came by rail. Another thing, I remember we used to think it was a big thrill to come and watch the special trains that came up from Southern California for the Stanford UCLA and Stanford USC football games. It makes it sound like we didn't have a lot to do, but we'd come down and see these special trains and thought it was a pretty big deal.
Sure. So now, what was it like to be a kid in Los Altos? Bob K. Okay, I'll start with you this time. Was it boring? Did you have anything to do? Tell us about what you did.
I would have to say it was an excellent childhood. I don't think we were ever bored. We were always busy with something. We were either playing basketball down at the school or over in the scout hall. We were playing baseball during baseball season. We'd play football during football season. We'd go fishing up at Stevens Creek. We would ride our bikes over to Stanford on a Saturday and watch all the track meets and baseball games that Stanford was having, and swimming meets. We always had something to do. So it was a very good
So your
childhood.
mothers then would allow you to do all of this. I mean, they didn't have to transport you by car to
No.
any of,
Never
that's a
fear.
difference than what the mothers have to do now.
On weekends, I remember my mother used to just make a bagged lunch, and I would go out with my friends and wouldn't be back till dinner time. And we would play around in the trees, a lot of tree tag and playing in the poison oak, chasing rabbits, and we even raised 5 sparrowhawks at one time,
neat.
just for the fun of doing that.
Now, were both of you Scouts, Boy Scouts?
Yes.
Okay, so, and who was your Scout
Ed
master?
McDowell was
Yeah.
probably one of the finest people
Yeah.
at
Well, we've
Los Altos
interviewed
Public.
him.
Oh, you
He's
have? Good.
wonderful,
Well, then
yes.
people know about Ed McDowell, but he was a very special person who just gave all of his spare time to the Scouts, and he would come down on Saturdays and help us pass tests, and he saw to it that we really understood what the Scout law meant and the Scout oath.
And there was
what
an
it did.
actual building here dedicated to
Right.
Scouts.
Oh, yes, yeah,
Scout Hall.
with a basketball court, what have you. We even played basketball with anybody we could find to play with us, and we'd charge 10 cents a person and raise a little money for the Scouts so we could buy
If
new
anybody
tents.
has a picture of Scout Hall, we really appreciate
Oh,
it over at
boy.
History House, because we don't really have one. So.
Good thinking.
Okay, now another sort of ubiquitous part of being here in Los Altos in the 30s were the orchards.
I remember cutting cuts. We used to, and picking cuts. We used to work in the fruit and picking prunes and dipping prunes in lye and picking cherries. We used to work in the fruit, and when we were younger and make enough money so that we could go to Boy Scout camp for a week or 2 weeks.
How much would you make? Do you remember? No.
Yeah, they used to pay you 10 cents a box for cutting apricots.
For a tray that was
And
quite large.
Yeah.
some of the women that were pros could cut maybe 20 or 25 boxes a day. People like myself were lucky if they cut 10 boxes a day. So you'd make maybe
Sometimes we cut our fingers
$1.
more than
yeah,
they.
right. Right.
Give it a little extra
A little
flavor,
extra.
huh?
It was really very nice. It
Yeah.
added something to
Now,
it.
did your mothers can and all of that? Yes.
Everybody
So
did,
they
yeah.
processed
Yeah.
the fruit and all of that.
Yeah.
So,
We had about 2 acres under cultivation up at our
Yeah.
place, and ultimately Dad put in a big freezer so that we could just toss stuff in and freeze it, and
now,
worked out well.
some of the buildings in downtown Los Altos, as you know, have been preserved. They're still there from the first days of Paul Schaup and the Altos Land Company. Of all the buildings that have been preserved downtown, what is your favorite, Bob Kay?
Well, I hate to say this first.
This is
but
gonna hurt.
The train station is the one that is most familiar. The thing that really looks like it did in the old days is the train station.
Yeah. And actually, the train station is eligible to be on the National Register of
Oh, it
Historic,
should be, yeah.
I
historic
would think so.
Places. So.
How old do they have to be on?
It's not
national-
age as much as it's integrity,
Oh,
the
about as
integrity
old
of
as
the
you.
building. It looks like
Not
you
that
say, just the way it did in 1913. So, how about you, Bob?
Well, there are a lot of really very nice old homes too, like on University Avenue was a magnificent thing right down there by Schaup Park, and a number of other ones. It seems to me a lot of the older homes are there on University Avenue, and I imagine some of those probably go back 40 and 50
Yeah,
years
they do.
anyway.
They do.
Yeah.
Now, what about Los Altos has remained the same for you, Bob, and what's changed? I know a lot has changed, but what's remained the same?
Boy, am I glad I don't have to
That's a
answer
tough
that one.
question. Well,
I'm throwing
basically,
you a
as
curve.
far as I'm concerned, downtown is the same. Main Street, first, second, third, first, San Antonio, all that sort of thing. So it's still the same old downtown triangle, and there really isn't too much business anyplace else other than a small amount out at Loyola Corners, and of course the Rancho
little bit on
Shopping
El
Center,
Camino
and a little
now.
bit on El Camino.
Yeah.
So downtown Los Altos is about the same as it always was, except that it no longer has a motion picture theater.
I know, that's a shame.
And,
That
That's
is
a shame. That was a real loss to Los Altos when we lost that.
right.
So how about you, Bob? I know you haven't lived here in Los Altos for all that.
For quite a
all that
long time now, since about 44, I guess I've been gone. But one of the things that I find missing is the open space and
Yeah.
that was not developed. The areas where we could just go for miles and play in the woods and one thing another, that is gone. A lot of the orchards are gone as well. And
I think
but
that's
it's still
what-
a beautiful city. It is a city. I guess maybe that's the difference.
Yes.
It's gone from being a town to a city.
Yeah.
Yes, it was a very distinct personality. Now, if you had to give me a short answer to this, what would your most vivid memory, being a child of Los Altos, be? If you would just have to pick out one, what would it be, Bob K?
Oh, wow. Well, the ability just to roam freely as I wanted to, and get together with 2 or 3 of the fellows or scouts and say, hey, let's go camp. And we used to be able to go up El Monte Avenue to a place on Central Drive where there was a little creek, and a gentleman would let us use his property, and we'd go up there and go camping over the weekend.
That doesn't happen now.
It's hard to do that now, yeah.
How about you, Bob T?
Well, I almost hate to admit this, but one of my most vivid memories is building a clubhouse down below a home that was being built by a very fine Dutch gentleman named Mr. Gantvort, and we were using his nails and his lumber to build our clubhouse. And we worked, of course, on Saturdays and Sundays, and his crew members worked during the week.
More conventional
More
hours.
conventional hours. And one time they got wise and came and caught us at it, and I, running away, left my baseball mitt with my name in it. So my father sent me back to tell Mr. Gantvort I'd been stealing his lumber, and then I was to offer him $5. Well, of course, we had stolen hundreds of dollars worth of lumber. Dad probably made a special deal for him, but he was so nice about it that I just ran home crying. He said, I don't want to take your money, son, but please don't steal my lumber anymore.
Well, that's a wonderful way to end our interview tonight. It's just been delightful to have both of you. Thank you very much for visiting us on the Los Altos History Show.
Thank you.
And we thank you, our viewers, for tuning in tonight. And I hope that you've enjoyed sort of strolling down memory lane with
Well,
Bob and Bob.
been a lot of fun
And
for
we
us.
hope that you watch us the next time. Bye for now.